Greetings, this is Professor Lazarus again. Today we will talk about product costs, and before I get into my lecture, I'm going to step aside for a minute and give you an opportunity of writing down some of the notes that I have assembled for you on the whiteboard behind me. Okay, let's assume in this example that Morgana Manufacturing Company produces tables. Product costs, all product costs can be categorized into three subgroups: direct materials DM, direct labor DL, manufacturing/factory overhead. I use both the terms because some textbooks use factory overhead and some textbooks use manufacturing overhead. So if you see the abbreviations FOH, that's factory overhead. If you see the abbreviation MOH, that's manufacturing overhead, they both mean the same thing, just depends on what book you're using. Let's talk a little bit more in detail about each of these components of a product cost. Direct materials. There are a couple of items here that I have tried to highlight in terms of what makes up or what are the features or what are the qualities of direct materials. Traceable to products. So a direct material can be directly traced to a cost object, in this case a table that we're manufacturing. Direct material makes up a significant quantity of that final product, the table that we're manufacturing. A direct material, the value of the direct material that is used is quite high in relation to the value of the final product cost. An example of a direct material would be wood. So wood would be the main component, for instance, in this table that Morgana Manufacturing Company is producing. Next, we'll look at the direct labor component, and direct labor also follows the same pattern. That is, the direct labor can be directly traced to the product being manufactured, the table. The direct labor is in significant quantities of the product, and the direct labor value is relatively high in relation to the final product cost. An example of a direct labor would be carpenters' wages. So you have carpenters that are actually producing these tables, and all of their wages would be normally classified as direct labor. Next, we'll get into the third component, which oftentimes students find a little more confusing, and that's your manufacturing factory overhead. One way to try to make sense of this component is to break out the factory manufacturing overhead into three additional subcomponents. One subcomponent would be indirect materials, another one would be indirect labor, and a third one would be what I call the other manufacturing overhead category. Before we get into the specifics, let's look at some of the components or some of the items that make up manufacturing overhead. They are not traceable to the product. In this case, the product again we're manufacturing is a table. So a manufacturing overhead cost cannot directly be traced to the table. Next, the manufacturing overhead cost is in insignificant quantities. Third, the value of a manufacturing overhead item taken by itself may be relatively small or low in relation to the overall product cost. And finally, every manufacturing overhead item is directly related to the factory. So please keep these points in mind as we look into some of the specific components that make up the manufacturing factory overhead. So let's go back to the little diagram here. One component of manufacturing overhead is indirect materials. Going back to our example, I've used the example of nails. So let's assume that you need a couple of nails to hold your wood together that makes up your table. The nails, the cost of the nails is small in relation to the overall table cost. And so from an accounting standpoint, it's not cost effective to keep a track of what it costs as 10 nails or 12 nails that go into the table. So although the nails go directly into the table, from a cost standpoint, we try to avoid costing those 12 or 14 nails that were used. Instead, we'll cost the nail by the barrel as we buy them, rather than on an individual nail basis. Indirect labor. An example of indirect labor that I've shown you is a factory supervisor. So let's visualize this. Let's visualize the production floor of Morgana Manufacturing. You have 15 or 20 carpenters out there, every one of them making tables. And you have one supervisor supervising these 15 or 20 carpenters. The supervisor is not making the tables directly himself or herself. What does the supervisor do? Typically, he or she will be walking around the shop floor, supervising and monitoring his or her employees. Additionally, the supervisor may be engaged in administrative tasks as well as other supervisory responsibilities. So the supervisor's salary cannot be directly traced to a specific table the way we can trace a carpenter's wages to a specific table. So a factory supervisor's salary is considered to be indirect labor, which in turn is part of your manufacturing overhead cost. Then under the other manufacturing overhead category, some examples here would be factory rent, factory utilities, taxes on your factory, depreciation on your factory equipment, etc., etc. So the common denominator here would be all of these costs are factory related. So this gives you a larger picture of what makes up product costs, as well as then some of the details that make up the individual product costs. Again, that wraps up our discussion on product costs, and this is Professor Lazarus signing off. And as I always like to say, we accountants work our assets off. Thank you.